was the summer of 2014, and for my son's bar mitzvah present, just like many Jewish parents, we wanted him to bond with the Holy Land. Oh, it worked perhaps too well. My husband had stayed back at the hotel, and our friends, my son and I, had just stopped in a pharmacy.
Run to the bomb shelter, sweetie. Please hurry. I didn't hear the sirens at first, but the Israelis did. They're used to hearing these things. We ran to the back of the storeroom. It was a 12-foot by 24-foot windowless bomb shelter. My heart's pounding. Boom! Boom! I hear it and feel the percussion of the exploding bombs. I'm trying not to get sick. I look at my 13-year-old son and I think I'll never forgive myself if something happens to him.
That's an excerpt from a speech I gave to the Orange County Jewish Bar Association. It was the first, but not the last time we had to run to a bomb shelter. Our adventure and my transformation is also the subject of my book, Blasted from Complacency, A Journey from Terror to Transformation in Israel. There is no chapter in a parenting book on what to do when a war starts and you're on a family vacation. Think touring extraordinary and sacred sites mixed with cowering in bomb shelters. I'm still trying to get over the Jewish guilt of taking my son to war for his bar mitzvah present. The impact of being human targets helped me understand the plight of Israelis living like this, and it also made me want to work on peace. How Israel is often described on the news is not what I'd seen with my own eyes. And I felt Palestinian parents also preferred their children playing safely in their backyards. The missiles exploded just near enough to blow apart my world as I knew it, forever changing me. And you'd never recognize my life today with what it was like then. I believe I found my life's purpose. Hello, I'm Penny St., and I'm the host of Peace with Penny. In today's episode, we will be speaking with Shepha Vainstein, co-founder and president of reGeneration Education. As we hear about war-torn Ukraine daily in the news, we are reminded of the tragedy of violent conflicts and its impact on people and especially on children who are innocent pawns with no say in the matter. reGeneration Education advances peace building through innovative approaches to the education, development, and resilience of young children in crisis zones so they are able to imagine and create a better future. Many children, especially those in Israel and the West Bank, are affected by toxic stress. Violent conflict and poverty are the most common culprits. Toxic stress harms a child's life in many ways: brain development, academic achievement, and mental and physical health. Even their likelihood of committing violent crimes increases. Perhaps the most tragic side effect is the stalled development of empathy, a foundation for peace building. reGeneration Education addresses childhood toxic stress for Jewish, Christian, and Muslim children by partnering with and co-sponsoring trauma-informed schools for children in Israel and the West Bank, hosting conferences and trainings focused on educating children in crisis zones for Western and Middle Eastern kindergarten and elementary school teachers, and initiating and building interfaith networks in the U.S. that model healing in the Middle East. The impact of conflicts on children is particularly hard to hear. As a mom, it hurts me deeply that the next generation can be impacted for the rest of their lives through no fault of their own. Shepha Vainstein co-founded reGeneration Education after a trip with her family to the Holy Land in 2005 that changed her life. When Shepha visited education communities in Israel and the West Bank, she became convinced that trauma-informed education for children in crisis zones must be provided in order to build the ground necessary for sustainable peace in that volatile region. Ms. Vainstein received her Master's of Counseling Psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute. Licensed as a psychotherapist, she maintained a private psychotherapy practice in the LA area where she specialized in trauma recovery and personal empowerment until she left her practice to devote more time to reGeneration Education's work. hearing on our nightly news how the children of Ukraine are now living with the ravages of war and toxic stress is rampant, we'll be speaking with Shepha, and she'll be sharing her expertise. Unfortunately, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has provided many years to gain knowledge of the damage war does to the psyche of children. So let's begin. Welcome, Shepha.
Hi, thank you, Penny. Thank you for having me here.
I'm thrilled that you can join us. I'm familiar with what it's like to visit Israel and have your entire life change. Shepha, can we begin with a story in 2005 with your trip to the Holy Land that changed your life?
Yes, and just, you gave such a beautiful summary, and your story as well is very moving about finding yourself in the bomb shelter. And that actually, I want to pick up right there because my daughter was going to be an exchange student in Israel. And the Israeli teacher that was going to be the host family, when we brought her there to Israel, he was giving us a tour of his house. And he opened up this door and he introduced us to his bomb shelter. And that was my lesson, is like every house that is built in Israel has to have a bomb shelter. And it was so beyond my frame of reference.
Excuse me, I would say, and it's very disconcerting, like if you're in a hotel and there's really not a bomb shelter, but they take you to the stairwell, it just doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel as safe.
And that is a piece of the access to the bomb shelters and equal access to bomb shelters. It's a whole number. So I remember taking photos of the door to the bomb shelter because it was just something I had never seen before. And just even trying to wrap my head around, now growing up in Southern California, we've got the earthquake territory. And
Yes.
so, people wonder how we live with this. But the idea that this is something that humanity does to one another, that you have to have this just in case, it was already just really something that was beyond my frame of reference until then. And this particular Israeli teacher, he was going from Israel into the West Bank, into Jenin, and coaching teachers at a girls' high school there. And before I came to Israel, he had told me they needed books in English. And I happened to walk into Costco and I found 50 American classics for $50. So I picked up a couple boxes of those and shipped them to the teacher so he could bring them to the school. And so when we were planning our visit there, he said, "Do you want to meet the people that you helped?" And I said, "Sure." And so when we got to Israel, he had made arrangements for us to come in and meet the teachers. And I guess news of this had been not long after the entire military incursion into Jenin. And there had been fights and a lot of rubble around, and it wasn't exactly a tourist site. And so news got around that there's this American couple, me and my husband, that were coming there. And we were invited to meet this Palestinian leader. And I had prepared beforehand, my sister, who was in charge of rolling out a violence prevention program called Second Step Violence Prevention Program for the Los Angeles Unified School District, had managed to get this kit donated to me. And it is a social emotional learning program that teaches empathy, impulse control, and anger management. And so this has been, the wave in education in the United States is social emotional learning. So the question is, how do you help bring it to the Middle East and, help that wave continue? So I had this kit. And when I met this Palestinian leader, I was telling him, we have problems with violence in Los Angeles, and we have problems, and we have found that this particular learning modality for social emotional learning has been really helpful. And the Palestinian leader said something to me that changed my life. And that was the pivotal moment. And he had said to me, and you have to realize when we were coming in, literally there's rubble everywhere from this military incursion. I had seen the bomb shelter at, at this Israeli teacher's house.
Mhm.
And then he says to me, we don't have, this leader says to me, we don't have problem with violence in the classroom. We don't have problem with drugs in our classroom. Our problem is the occupation. What do I tell my daughter when she sees tanks coming down the street? And the meeting, in a typical Palestinian meeting, there's usually pretty chaotic and cell phones going and people coming in and out. And when this leader said this to me, everything got deadly silent. You could hear a pin drop because everyone wanted to listen to what my response was going to be. And I said to this leader, I said, children can't learn if they don't feel safe. And then as a psychotherapist, I've been trained to look for openings and to meet people where they're at. So this particular program I brought wasn't going to be it. So when I said to him, children can't learn when they don't feel safe, but there is an education that produces such safety in the classroom that when the parents take their children there, the parents themselves don't want to leave the classroom because it feels so good to be there. And this education came out of the ashes of World War I, when people were asking, how could we educate our children so there'll be no more war? And it's called Waldorf education. And that opened up a fascinating questioning period about this Waldorf education. So ironically, Waldorf education is a trauma-informed education that was developed when Europe was in shambles. And people were asking, what do we do for the next generation? And so it's been around since 1919. When this Palestinian leader asked me his question, that became such a life-changing event for me because we can have this enemy image that we're carrying around about each other. And the real question is, how can we unite with our concerns, and especially over our love for our children and our desire to see our children flourish? And so I realized that probably the most part of the work that needs to happen is to find common interests and getting people mobilized and working together in common interests. And so I found that education is not only is it generative and supportive in helping to create an environment for the next generation, but it's a way of bringing people together. And since then, we've had several conferences in Jerusalem with David Yoelin Academic College. And it has been with Israelis and Palestinians looking at how do we educate children in crisis zones. And everyone, the teachers are left really empty-handed at this point. You might have, horrible situations, an acute situation, the bombs are dropping, the bombs are exploding, the people are coming in, they're dealing with it. Then the psychologists leave, the therapist leaves, and the teachers are left now trying to rebuild after this mess. And so this is something that is common for Israelis and Palestinians of what do you do? So this is it's a timely piece to address, and everyone's asking the question. And right now, as we're talking about with Ukraine, this is going to be a big piece. And so, what do you do for the children?
Can you talk about what toxic stress actually is?
So stress itself is very beneficial. I mean, they found that children naturally do jump rope because the pounding onto the ground stresses the bones and actually secretes chemicals that strengthen bones. So this bones, for instance, need stress in order to grow and become stronger and tougher. We need a certain degrees of stress to challenge ourselves and to build a sense of self-confidence. Toxic stress is when it is ongoing and there's a certain sense of not being able to address it, to reduce it, and that there's a constant stress on the system. And the chemicals that are involved in handling stress, like cortisol, end up tearing into the system and creating long-term effects. So when you have a child that's growing up in toxic stress, they're finding, for instance, that the part of the brain that works with fear, the amygdala, is actually larger in children who have grown up under chronic toxic stress. And the difficulty about that is that we have a brain, they call it a tripartite brain. We've got the reptilian brain, which is the fight and flight part of our brain, fight, flight, or freeze. We've got the limbic system, which is what there's called the mammalian part of the brain, which has the emotions in it. And then we have the neocortex, which is the thinking part of our brain, which is the cool-headedness that we need in order to really problem solve and think through situations. So if you have, for instance, in a large amygdala, you're activated into the fear center. So you're going to be reactive and you're not going to be able to think through things with a cool head.
What is intergenerational trauma?
So this has been what they have found, for instance, the children of Holocaust survivors, where they're saying that their system actually is responding in similar ways to their parents. There's a legacy that's left over. So we're finding now that if trauma happens, there's a certain transmission to it. And your question really brings a bigger question here when we look, for instance, at the legacy of something like what is going on in Israel and Palestine, where you have, this horror that happened from the Holocaust. You've got, where the Jewish people, there was an attempt to annihilate the Jewish people. And then you have these people that have come that have been so traumatized. Then you have the issues that there's already people on the land, and it's like, the whole issue of coming together and creating a homeland of where there's everyone working together. There's this legacy that can happen, that can be passed down to generation of that trauma, which then when you have a sense of trauma, you don't see clearly about what are all the options on the table. And we tend to move, when we go into trauma, tend to move into more of a fear mode and move into that more panic mode of fight, flight, or freeze.
Can you talk about what regeneration education is?
Regeneration education promotes peace building through supporting the education of children in crisis zones. And one of the branches of our work is leveraging the existence of the Waldorf schools in Israel, which is a lot is based on trauma-informed principles. It's a holistic education, which trauma affects children physiologically as well. So you need to approach education as a holistic endeavor for the child to create that healing environment. And so because it's already been so strong and so much work has happened in the Waldorf communities and the Jewish communities in Israel, it's a natural focus to go ahead and support bicultural Jewish Arab Waldorf endeavors. And so we support several kindergartens. We also support an Arab endeavor in Shfar'am called Tamrat El Zaitoun, which is the little seed of the olive tree. And this is a branch that we do. And then we also support in the West Bank House of Hope, which is a Palestinian Waldorf school. And the thing that's really delightful is, again, this is a way where there's cross-border appreciation and working together, because what everyone wants to have the best school as possible and to be able to be good teachers. So there's a joint interest in perfecting yourself as a teacher, developing as a teacher, so that you can be the best you can for yourself and provide the best in your classroom for your children.
Awesome. I did want to share this great video.
How do you raise a child in a place that's full of trauma to feel that they have the same chance at happiness and well-being that every other child in the world does?
after a night that you don't sleep and your children was afraid and there was a bomb and siren, reality עולה על כל דמיון.
It's more than any film you can make up.
The trauma, the insecurity of a society in which warfare is always at the brink, in which there could be a bomb or a rocket or this or that, you know, that's just, it's tangible.
They always say, I cannot remember. I cannot remember. It is as everything goes in and out, and I have no access to my body.
And the children will ask you, why we are shot by gun? Why are we facing this war?
You can see the kids are a little bit more intense.
How do you educate people past their fear and anger?
The fear has a physiological process, and this is why children who are afraid have difficulty learning and remembering.
אני עובד המון באמפתיה עם ילדים עם בעיות התנהגות או בעיות קשב וריכוז, המון.
The aggression comes out of his shattered nerve system.
What is my task in a conflict area is to show my children there are more ways than what they are usually as shown by the TV or the public.
Not talking about what kind of Arab are you Muslim or Christian, what kind of Jew are you, where have you arrived from, it doesn't matter.
It's so essential to begin with the youth. It's only later these ideas are pumped into our heads that we're different.
فكرة إنه الولد هناك بمرق مرحلة اللي هي أهم مرحلة بحياته بالجيل هذا.
Because we know that when children experience those years in a healthy way, then they go into their elementary school and they're whole.
We want them to grow up and feel in a natural way to belong, just to belong to this place.
يعني التعليم إلى ما لا نهاية. أهم شيء التعليم مش سلاح الإنسان اللي هي شهادته.
Our hope is in educating our children in such a way that they see forgiveness and compassion and understanding and redemption and healing as every bit as important as math and science.
Today, almost every place becomes a conflict area. So the solution that the educators here develop can be taken to heal other places.
If we work with the young children now, then we stop the war 20 years from now.
In this way, it has to be done in this very moment. You can't wait for the politicians.
Let's do it. Don't wait. And we can do it right here and now.
That film always gets to me. It's
to me too, Penny. It gets to me.
It's something. You did a great job with it. I always like to ask some personal questions, if you don't mind, to get to know what created the peacemaker I'm speaking with, and hopefully encourage others once they realize, hey, they're just like me, and maybe they'll get on the peace wagon too. So where did you grow up, and did you have a religious affiliation when you were growing up?
Yes. I have an interesting background. My maiden name was Schneerson. So I my grandfather came out of the Hasidic line and was born in Sfat, and then was convinced to go to Montreal to become a teacher.
Sfat's such an interesting place. I loved it when we were there. The juxtaposition between the very old religious and the modern artsy kind of feel is very interesting.
My grandfather ended up in Los Angeles, taking his family there and becoming a teacher at the Los Angeles Jewish Academy, which was part of the historic Breed Street Shul in Los Angeles. And my father ended up getting married and moving to Glendale. And Glendale was, when I was a child, there were still laws on the books that you couldn't have blacks on the street after 10 o'clock at night.
Wow.
It was
wow.
A very conservative, doesn't even say the atmosphere that Glendale was at that time. And amazingly, my father became the first Jewish city councilman in the city of Glendale. And so I learned a lot from my father's work that he did in the community. And meanwhile, my mother was a school teacher in East LA. And I used to go with her, and it was in a very, very low economic area that also had a lot of gangs. And so I would go with her to school and help her in her classroom. And my mother was an incredibly dedicated teacher. And it was there, that I saw what teachers can do for children. And there were times where I remember vividly, there was one child and she grieved. She said, I just didn't do it for him. And, she took each child into her heart so deeply. And so I think it's a real place where I knew from firsthand what teachers can give, what they can do, then really the influence that they can have for children and their families. So this was, just a primary experience that I had. And so I became originally a psychotherapist and was fine in my practice. And then this was totally unscripted, the whole experience that I had in Israel and Palestine. But it was one of those things where I just knew that no one else was doing it and it needed to be done. And so we became this organization and started it. And, really without our help right now, several of the schools wouldn't be in existence because they needed that support. And my father had been in part of the Jewish underground that smuggled concentration camp survivors from Marseille into Haifa after World War II. And I always think about, these people that are on the front lines that are trying to do what's needed. And I really feel that these educators that are there on the ground in Israel and Palestine are in dire need of support, and that this is where we can change the tide and make such a difference. So, and for me, it's very satisfying because when I first started our organization in 2005, 2006, it was, this was still really fresh after, 9/11 and 9/11. And so there was still a strong anti-Muslim sentiment that was going on in the American community. And, through the years right now, the interfaith work has become so much more of a norm. And in my time since starting the organization, I've already seen such a conscious shift of taking something and how do you build bridges? How do you transcend, that sense of suspicion and distrust and find out that there's a human being here and we could work together. So I've been watching it happen in the interfaith community in the United States and, know that the big job is to not give up. That's the big job. And that things happen, there is conflict that arises, bombings happen, there are raw feelings that happen on both sides. And the important thing is to not give up and find our way through it to continue the momentum, because you do it for the children. You don't give up for the children.
Yeah. Well, I always say when you're talking about support, I thought of your husband and how supportive he's been with your journey. If you want to talk a little bit about that, because I just was really impressed.
I'm always happy to talk about my husband because I'm so grateful for him. So my husband was given 6 months to live in January 2003. And in March 2003 is when the United States began bombing Iraq. And so I was in this situation. He had metastasized melanoma. There were tumors throughout his body. And so I was in the situation of trying to help save his life. I literally felt like I was trying to pull him out of the grave when our country went to war, and thousands and thousands and thousands of people died while I was trying to save my husband's life. And we did find people that could think outside the box. We did find people who could save his life, and he is with me to this day, and
Amen.
and he was there in Jenin when I had that conversation with the Palestinian leader, and he witnessed what happened in that room. And in his deepest part of his soul, he understood the significance of the potential and the significance of the vision and the significance of the work. So he has actually been, a rock in my life that has allowed me to continue the work. And I say, I give him strength to live, and he gives me strength to give. That's
how cool.
That's about how I describe our relationship. So
that's very cool. Yeah. You've been very blessed, both of you.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit of your history of regeneration education? You've grown, obviously, over the years.
Well, we actually started out as a part of our program was a high school program. So we had this, this Palestinian kindergarten teacher training program. And then we did a high school program for 2 years. And so it was with Jewish teenagers from a kibbutz Harduf, which was a Waldorf school in the Galilee, with Palestinian teenagers in Shfar'am, which is very close to kibbutz Harduf. And we spent 2 years supporting that program. And one of the things that I learned out of that was the educational disparity between the Jewish students and the Palestinian students in Israel. And so there was a lot of money going into remediating those students that were coming from Shfar'am, because they didn't have the same resources and they didn't have the same educational background. And that's when I started to turn to early child education. And I started to realize there's a work of an economist, James Heckman, who talked about the upstream investment in investing in early child education and how economically wise that is in the long run. And I ended up finding that out on my own, basically, after supporting this high school program for 2 years. And so we turned then to the kindergartens. And at that time, Tamrat al-Zaitoun in Shfar'am had started as this is the first Arab Waldorf school in the state of Israel, had just started. So what we did is we pivoted from the high school program to early child education. And so James Hickman, who's an economist, talked about the upstream solution of investing in early childhood education to make social change. And so we began to support the very first Jewish Arab Waldorf kindergarten in Israel, which is Ein Bustan. Mm-hmm. And also at that time, this little seedling in Tamrat al-Zaitoun, that was just the kindergarten at that time. And so that was the beginning of the work. And through the years, reGeneration supported the growth of that little Arab Waldorf kindergarten in Tamrat al-Zaitoun in Shfar'am until it is a full school now, kindergarten through 8th grade, and has been officially recognized by the state of Israel and is funded. So, one of the things that I feel is our opportunity as an organization is to identify these potentials that need support and need strengthening and help them grow. So Tamrat al-Zaitoun has been a big success story. And today there are Palestinian parents in Haifa and in Nazareth who are driving their children to that school in Shfar'am and carpooling there. So because their children to be getting that education.
Since we seem to be going there, let me share my screen and we will get into the PowerPoint and talk about the different locations that you do support.
Yeah.
So,
yes.
So let's go back and talk about Ein Bustan, which is, I love that story, obviously, particularly since they're a school of both Jewish kids and Arab kids. So if you could talk a little bit about them.
So Ein Bustan is the very first bicultural Waldorf kindergarten in the state of Israel. And so it's in a little Bedouin village called Hilf, which is outside of Kiryat Tivon, which I call it, for my California standards, I call Kiryat Tivon in a suburb of Haifa. You would never, ever look at that in the state of Israel and say Kiryat Tivon is a suburb of Haifa, but from California standards, that's what I call it. Mm-hmm. And so the Jewish parents drive their children into this little Bedouin village for this kindergarten. And I had the pleasure of standing there in the kindergarten and watching these little Jewish children and these little Arab children playing. And one of the things in this curriculum, in early child education in the Waldorf curriculum, is scaffolding free play for children. And this is a very, very important component. So you feed the child's imagination with fairy tales and stories that helps to inspire their sense of play. And then you, as they kind of spontaneously take it in and work with it, the teacher might step in occasionally as needed to keep the flow going. And this is an art form as a kindergarten teacher. But what you're really trying to do is get the children to self-generate their play and to play together. And so I got to see these little children in the kindergarten speaking Arabic and speaking Hebrew, creating an imaginary world together and playing together. And this is not something that then is even orchestrated by the teacher, but it comes out of their own spontaneousness in creating together. And so this is so far away from talking about peace. This is actually creating peace in the moment and the kind of world that we want to create. And these children create it right then and there. It's the most thrilling thing that it's like a dream come true for me to sit and watch.
Yeah, I can imagine. I'd be bawling my eyes out.
Absolutely magnificent. So it's a very established kindergarten. There's I feel that people involved in all these schools to me are heroic. And so I have so much admiration. There's a Benny Mosenson has been now with the school for quite some time. And here he had, top security clearance by the state of Israel. And then after leaving that job that he did with his top security clearance, this is what he does, is he goes and helps to support the school and keep the school growing, because he understands that this is the direction that the state of Israel needs to move in. And this is of the vital importance here, there at Ein Bustan.
Yeah, I often say that people like yourself are angels on earth, and many people, particularly on the Palestinian side, risk their lives to do this because of the anti-normalization attitudes. Not that it's any picnic if you're Israeli and do this, or Jewish Israeli and do this, but it's definitely can be a dangerous situation. Although quite often, most people I talk to say 90% of the people on both sides want peace, and it's really only the extremists who are in the news. I always say, the old expression, if it bleeds, it leads. And really, that's the purpose of me doing Peace with Penny, is I want people to know there are many, many people who want peace, and many, many people who already work on peace. They just don't make the news. So
the Rodef Shalom, you have to pursue peace. You might want it, but you have to pursue it.
Yes, but I mean, there are many people who do take action, but they don't write about them for whatever reasons they have.
I think this is publicizing the work is extremely important, because we need to fight the cynicism and despair.
Yes.
There are many Hebrew speaking and Arabic speaking people who say, I do not want to hear the word shalom. I don't want to hear the word salam, because there's so much disillusionment and so much disappointment there. So it just brings up pain and despair. So this is a part of the work, is how do we keep re-inspiring and helping to protect the spirit of the children, so that they don't have that sense of cynicism and despair that maybe their parents' generation has. So this is something that is really an important part of education, is protecting the spirit of childhood.
Amen. And we have Tamrat El-Zaytun.
Tamrat El-Zaytun, the fruit of the olive tree. And so this is this is actually an interfaith school with Muslims, Christians, Druze, all together. And you're seeing a little bit of the curriculum there of the music that the children learn. They are have their little flute cases at their side while they're playing their flutes. They knitted those flute cases. And there's a lot of research now, for instance, in knitting, how that is very relaxing to the system. So not only does knitting increase the nimbleness in the fingers, which actually stimulates growth of the brain, but it helps to promote the relaxation system in the body as well. So the idea when you have a holistic education, the children there that are baking bread or baking pita, that's a tactile experience. And when you work with stress, you have to address the body through the senses. And so the sense of touch, has to be met in the right way. So the idea of kneading the bread is very calming. Going outside and playing in the dirt and the earth is very calming. So these are all things that we have to, provide for the children so that they have a healthy relationship to their environment rather than a feeling and carrying in their bodies the sense that the environment is dangerous and fearful.
I've been meeting with some folks who work on the environment, working on peace in the environment, and they were making the comment how soothing working with the earth is to, we're animals. So it's just innate in us to feel soothed by that.
Yes, so that is the playing in the mud. Playing, that's a very important part of kindergarten is the mud play. It's very important. And I actually did a workshop, a few years back, and some of it was in mud work. And I was like, I forgot about this. That was, I knew intellectually, but to touch into it again really brought back a lot of memories for me. You'll see in that middle picture there's a gentleman playing the oud, which is, a very revered Arab instrument. And
it's like is it like a guitar or a mandolin?
Yes, and I'll say yes because I don't know more than that, but it's quite old. And one of the things that was very special about Tamrat al-Zaitoun, so the Waldorf education was developed actually in Stuttgart, Germany. And then when Hitler came to power, there are a lot of German Jews that came to Israel that were steeped in this philosophic approach to education. So there had been this seeding in the Israeli society for establishing Waldorf schools, which is what I think helped to tend the ground, speaking of gardening, for the sprouting of so many of these Waldorf schools in the state of Israel, in the Jewish communities. And so here you have in Tamrat al-Zaitoun, you had basically Palestinian teachers in Israel that are studying at Jewish Waldorf teacher trainings in Hebrew, then taking everything they learn and translating it into Arabic, and then figuring out how can they bring their own culture so that it feels natural to their community. And this has been one of the interesting things about Waldorf education is that it has to be relevant to the culture in which the school is based. So the Israelis had to bring this from Germany, or for those that study in the United States, and bring it into Israel and figure out how to work with the Jewish calendar, the Jewish language, and to take the curriculum and make it relevant to their lives on that level, culturally and religiously. And so this at Tamrat al-Zaitoun is really a very interesting R&D spot for education on how to take this and bring this into the Palestinian culture. You work with handwork like embroidery, and the Palestinian culture is beautiful embroidery. So you have a lot of inspiration there. Beekeeping is part of the Palestinian culture. So working with the agriculture and having a beehive, that's part of it. And so there's a wonderful ways that you can take the beauty of what the Palestinian culture has and bring it into Waldorf education that's actually healing for children.
We've talked a lot about the Waldorf education system, but in little parts here and there. Would you mind kind of just in 3 or 4 sentences to recap the philosophy?
Basically, the idea is it's really a holistic approach to education where that you are, it's not just about educating the brain of the child, that you understand that the child goes through a developmental a developmental arc. And in early child education, children have to be able to move and have be able to move their bodies. That's extremely important because there's a whole way that they take in the world. So you can't really ask children to sit at desks because they need to be able to move and play freely. The element there is that there's an understanding that of rhythm. So sometimes you have movement and maybe a noisier time, and then sometimes you have quiet time. And so in the kindergarten, they talked about an in-breath and an out-breath, that there's times for activity and there's times for more quiet. And in the kindergarten, for example, the teachers are trained to have dolls there that don't have features. They're made out of fabric, they're stuffed with wool, they're all made out of natural fabric. But I went to Tom Riddle's Ituin with a child psychologist once, and I held up one of their dolls and I said to her, "Why does this doll not have a face?" And she immediately knew. She said, "So the child can project its feelings onto the doll." And so it's a way for the child to act out of their own being, their own lives. So if it's their way of resolving things. So play is very important in early child education. And then the teacher is the one that really holds the emotional feel of the class. They're trained to do a puppet show, for instance, with these kind of dolls that I spoke about. And they might do a folk tale or a little fairy tale. And the way they're trained to do it is with a very slow cadence as they tell their fairy tale. And, there's so much about entertaining young children and making sure that you have the right, visuals for children and the monitors and the TVs. And then you watch these children sitting and listening to this fairy tale that's being told so slowly and thoughtfully with the puppets. And you suddenly see the little child's jaw begin to drop in awe as they start to fold into the fairy tale or the story, and their breath begins to slow down. And what's amazing is that these teachers are almost like yoga teachers in creating this sense of relaxation within the child as they're taking in this, they're being fed, their souls are being fed by these fairy tales. Einstein said, if you want to have raise an intelligent child, have them read fairy tales. And if you want them more intelligent, have them read more fairy tales. So the fairy tales have a place in really stimulating that imagination and, creating teaching experiences through story, which is, from as a Judaism, we're known for that as teaching through story. It's the story of Torah. So it's very relevant in the younger years. Then in the middle school, in the elementary school years, they are moved by stories as well. And a lot of stories are brought in the middle school to help inspire and to answer the child's own emotional life that they're having from 7 to 14. So in Waldorf education, you look at 0 to 7 as one developmental period, 7 to 14 as a second developmental period, and then 14 on to 21 is the third major developmental period. And the 14 to 21 is really the intellectual one, where there's the big focus on academics then and real critical thinking, developing very strong critical thinking skills. So the Waldorf education, the important piece about it is looking at what are the developmental needs of the child. And then when you take this into trauma-informed work, when you have a child who's traumatized, they lose their developmental track. They might backtrack. So you have to be able to identify where you can meet that child developmentally, where they need to be met so that they can get back on their developmental timeline.
Well, if we could bring up this other House of Hope.
Yes. So these are phenomenal Palestinian couple in East Jerusalem. And this is in Area C, which is considered, Area C is considered one of the more violent areas in the West Bank. And so these children are really subjected to bombing and gunfire frequently. And so Manar and Milad, who are the founders of House of Hope, have really dedicated themselves to a beautiful vision. I think you have brought in a beautiful video that has
Yes.
Milad narrating, and it'll give it a great idea of what their work is and their vision.
Yes, I am. Let me get to that.
As an organization and as a school, we believe in the transformative power of peace education that represented in NVC, nonviolent communication skills, compassionate listening that ensure and help and shape the character of the Palestinian children under the Israeli occupation. We use the puppet, we use the symbol of juggle and the symbol of ziraf. So kids can, if they have a conflict or disagreement or misunderstanding or accusation, so we give them a place to understand that judgment and blame could hurt, could block the way of communication, but compassionate listening and mercy and communication will help them to solve the conflict. The value of together is more important than the value of division. So it unites people, it helps people to see one another rather than to compete and to win. We are the only school in the West Bank that promotes these values. So we believe if this education will help them to be connected to human rights, values, to understand the concept of equality, human dignity, and mercy. It's like a safe place. It gives them knowledge and experience to solve and to communicate and to act in a peaceful way.
So earlier, Penny, you had talked about how trauma can actually affect the capacity for empathy. And this is so very true. And here in the West Bank, you have the House of Hope, which not only is working on developing the Waldorf curriculum, and it's really the very first Waldorf school in the West Bank. It's a Palestinian Waldorf school. But also they're incorporating nonviolent communication, which was founded by Marshall Rosenberg 25 years ago. And so my sister's a school psychologist. We talk about nonviolent communication. We say it's a PhD in empathy. And so this is a school that is really working with learning how to speak in a way that helps elicit the sense of humanity from the other, and learning how to help hold your sense of humanity within yourself. And the Munar and Milad, the founders of the school, are really under incredible stress and difficulties because it is in one of the most violent areas in the West Bank, and the children are under tremendous stress. And this is quite a gem here in the West Bank and what their vision is. And one of Milad's great inspirations is Martin Luther King. And he takes very deeply the teachings of Martin Luther King and helps to teach the Martin Luther King's ideals to the students in his school. It's an incredibly inspiring piece that the two of them are doing. Manar is a musician, and she helps to bring in the sense of music and joy. And Milad brings in his sense of vision as they incorporate nonviolent communication in the Waldorf curriculum. It's a very, very inspired vision that they're doing, and one that fills me with admiration.
That sounds beautiful.
It is beautiful. It's beautiful.
And then the last, you have the Orchard for the Children of Abraham, another Arab Jewish school.
Yes, and these are the founders, Ora and Ihab, and they are a couple in Jaffa. And Ihab's father has an acreage right there in Jaffa, and they have dedicated their family land to the building of this school. So right now there are several kindergartens there, and they do a lot of bridge building work on many, many levels. And it's a very popular and supported school as well.
That is totally awesome. What do you consider your overall mission to be?
Promoting peace building through supporting the education of children in crisis zones, and that's our big piece. So we have the Waldorf branch, and then we were going to be having an essence of learning training in the United States before the pandemic. I hope to be able to start working on that in the future. There's a she was actually in the one of the videos there, but the creator of Essence of Learning is Beatrice Rudeshauser-Rom, who developed kindergarten teacher training for crisis zones for Caritas. It's a Swiss relief agency. And this is when we talk about what's happening in Ukraine, the places all over the world. There is such a need for finding a way to help create, generally in areas of need, the education is even more strict. You're having children sitting at the desks. It's drill and kill where they're supposed to memorize things. And there's no sense about the developmental unfolding of the child. So it becomes even more critical to bring a developmentally appropriate sense of holistic education to these communities. So down the line, this is, you know, one of my big hopes is when we did our conference in Jerusalem, Beatrice was one of the speakers there. And I was so impressed with her work that she's doing in Essence of Learning. I feel that this is just like, you know, you see opportunities and you water those opportunities so they can grow the roots and stand on their own. This is something that needs a lot of support. So this will be one of my dreams down the line is to see another branch grow out called for Essence of Learning work.
You brought up Ukraine, and I don't think we can do the show given with what's going on without talking about it. Although you don't know exactly what's going on in the Ukraine right now, given your knowledge of conflict zones and the impact on children and people in general, how do you think the emotional toll is being played out with the inhabitants?
Oh, I'm sure that right now everyone is terrified. Everyone is in sheer terror. When you talk about your experience in the bomb shelter, just imagine that as of today, there's 660,000 refugees leaving Ukraine, and those that are left there. You know,
well, watching on the news, it's very much. There's actually a positive to what's on the news in that with today's technology, and you can see exactly what's going on, you know, it's like being there. And, you know, for me, I relive it when I hear the sirens go off or hear the bombs exploding or see the missiles in the sky, although they don't have Iron Dome and the missiles are actually landing as opposed to Israel being able to have the technology to blow up most, not all, but most of the Palestinian missiles in the sky before they can land, which is why there aren't so many dead Israelis, if you will. But I'm reliving it. But for people who've never been in that horrific situation, I believe it's an excellent learning tool because you are actually seeing, you know, dead bodies, etc., and it's horrific. But people need to know that war is hell, and there's a reason there are expressions like that, and there's a reason why we need to stop being in wars.
Well, I think that has been the impact. What's happened right now with the world coming together. You know, there's one of the big things, and this is what the work that you're doing, Penny, is trying to get through the buffer. There's a buffer that keeps us from being really feeling what's happening in the world around us. We're buffered by the Atlantic and the Pacific. As the United States, we've been buffered. We've been buffered by a lot of you know, winds of change that have happened on the globe. And So this whole place of reaching people have been reached right now, and this is the way the globe is coming together. You know, support of the Ukrainian people is wonderful, and hopefully opens a new door for however we move forward with that. You know, may this also contribute to the healing of our planet in somehow. You know, maybe each find our own task with it for healing. But again, there is a responsibility about shepherding this. You know, where you want to be able to have the right resources. One of the things that we did a teacher training in Lesbos, and when there were the floods of the immigrants coming through, and dealing with the sense of crisis there, and the chaos that's there. So creating safe spaces for children in the midst of chaos, and a sense of rhythm, a sense of predictability. All of these things are still so important in creating a sense of safety despite the chaos. And that, that's my hope, is that somehow the resources are going to come in there. But when I talk about the need on the planet, it's a great need right now.
Yes. For your final question, given what's going on in Ukraine and other places like Israel and Palestine, and the prevalence, unfortunately, of toxic stress for children, what is one thing a parent can do for a child who's in the middle of a toxic stress situation that can be helpful to lessen their anxiety?
The toxic stress can be an ongoing situation, but the first thing that the parent can do is calm themselves down, because the child,
we always have to begin with ourselves, don't we?
Begin with ourselves. The
inner peace is so important.
The child lives off of the emotional field of the caretaker, and so in creating a more spacious, regulated field as the caretaker, then the caretaker can help to create that within the child. And so taking a breath, coming back to center, that this is going to always be the first thing to remember. There's something called the empathy books that I wish I had known about as a mother when I was mothering my own children. And it's so darling. And so I would recommend Googling empathy books, because one of the things that happens for children is that we need to somehow put a story together. We need to do that. That's how we assimilate what happens in our life. And a young child going through an experience doesn't have the tools to put a narration together. They need the grown-ups to help do it. And so an empathy book is such a darling tool that parents can do for their children when they're going through hard times. And it's very simple, and just helping the child through drawing pictures and letting the child tell you what the picture to draw and what narration to do. It helps to help the child metabolize what the child is going through in some way, and helps the child feel seen and heard. So it was something that I recommend very highly, and to look it up.
Well, I know what the next gift I want to send my my cousin and her grandbaby, her 2-year-old.
You make them. So it's like
so
it's you learn how to make you take just regular printing paper that you'd have to in a printer, and hold it up and let the child, there's a whole little piece about it, so that it's the child's world becomes onto that book, and the narration, and the caretaker there helps to put it into some kind of sense. So it's a beautiful tool that I certainly wish I'd had as a parent. So I'm kind of giving a hot tip there.
That's very cool. Very cool. Well, thanks so much, Shepha, for we really appreciate your efforts to try to heal our kids so they can become more stress-free and ultimately a healthy part of society. Next week on March 8th at 11 a.m. Pacific time, we'll be talking with Ezeldine, who goes by Ez Masri, of the One Voice movement. From its inception in 2002, One Voice is focused on leveraging a critical but largely untapped resource within the Israeli and Palestinian public, the centrist mainstream, who support resolution of the conflict through a negotiated and a mutually acceptable two-state solution. The One Voice movement's mission is to drive a global initiative that supports grassroots activists in Israel, Palestine, and internationally who are working to build the human infrastructure needed to create the necessary conditions for a just and negotiated resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We hope you'll join us as we discuss how we can achieve an independent and viable Palestine and a secure Israel free from conflict, where Palestinians and Israelis are able to realize their national and individual aspirations, building a future based upon principles of security, justice, dignity, and peace. And for now, we close wishing you all live in peace, shalom, and salam.